Hi, I'm actor Ian Champion, and welcome to History of Horror Cinema, my podcast series devoted to the good, bad, and the ugly of horror movie history. Please don't forget to like what you hear and hit subscribe. I have such sights to show you. Tower of London, 1939. In November 1939, weeks after World War II broke out across Europe, Universal released Tower of London, their retelling of the machinations that led Richard, Duke of Gloucester, to become the short-lived King Richard III. For this version, director Roland V. Lee continued his sterling work with Basil Rathbone, from that year's Son of Frankenstein. He inhabits the main role in a plot that departs substantially from Shakespeare's famous play, which incidentally departs substantially from what we really know of Richard III himself, and also grants us two worthy supporting performances, from Vincent Price as his petulant brother, the Duke of Clarence, and an entirely fictional henchman of horror from Boris Karloff as Richard's deformed executioner Maud. The basic story of Tower of London is largely the one we are familiar with, in that it follows Gloucester as he ruthlessly kills his way to the crown, from his incumbent brother Edward, through his elder brother in line, Clarence, and then the young princes in the Tower, before taking the throne. Along the way, though, director Lee's brother Robert Lee fashions a screenplay that changes enough details for an engaging companion piece to Richard III. His prologue crawl sets us up for Machiavellian musical chairs. A web of intrigue veils the lives of all who know only too well that today's friends might be tomorrow's enemies. Rathbone's portrayal of Richard differs somewhat in appearance from the one we have loved to hate over the centuries. Whilst he is every inch the infamous schemer, the actor's suavity is allowed to dominate. He is not the physically hunched-over Olivier incarnation of stage and screen, or even the more extremely radical conception of Sir Anthony Sher in the 1980s. Embodying an almost literal bottled spider of externals, whirling around the Royal Shakespeare Company's stage on crutches as an arachnid-like creature. Rathbone's evil is in his inner nature, not an outer self tempted into histrionics. Whilst one could argue this is closer to the real Richard III, whose skeleton was recently unearthed under a Leicester car park, it's also debatable whether Richard himself was as evil as he was made out in the history books. Nevertheless, here his spinal curvature is incidental, a subtle rucksack rather than a hunchback for a leading man's performance rather than a character player. Whilst this may play to an actor's vanity, it also focuses our attention more believably on his political motives than vengeance for being cheated of fair nature. Vincent Price, whom we shall come to shortly, praised Rathbone's work as more historically accurate than Olivier's celebrated version. Our first sight of Richard shows him sparring lustily with his monarch brother Edward, Ian Hunter, whilst by contrast Miles Mander is suitably weak and vague as the reluctant King Henry. Karloff's Maud is emphasized more as the traditional horror movie villain. Bald-headed, his dark eyes glowering under bushy eyebrows and sporting a bowed and dragging right leg, he is the relishable monster of the piece. He commits fully to the nastiness of the man, and is introduced throwing water at a pleading, thirsty prisoner as if he were a stray dog. This is nothing compared to his later stabbing of King Henry while he prays on his knees with his back turned. Gloucester and he make an enjoyably unholy alliance, in much the same way that in Shakespeare's play the alliance is made between the Duke of Buckingham and Gloucester. The duo here is summed up by Rathbone as crookback and dragfoot. What we lack in physical perfection, we make up for here, indicating the brain. Tower of London is a real treat for horror genre fans, as in total there are 3 gentlemen of horror in attendance. Rathbone and Karloff are joined by a splendidly bratty interpretation of the Duke of Clarence, only the 3rd film role for a young Vincent Price. He is vividly the petulant eldest man-boy, woefully out of his depths when he tries to match cunning with his younger brother in a drinking contest. Shakespeare buffs will delight in Richard's hint of what is to come. Malmsey will be the only weapon. The overconfident Clarence giggles with fulsome maliciousness as he surveys Richard seemingly passing out at the table. No wonder, as they sup from huge tankards. His crowing is about to reach epic proportions. "Little crookback, you've met your master," when he sees Richard revive, fixing him with an awful, sober, unblinking resolve. Maud then drowns him in the traditional Malmsey butt of mythology. The received wisdom is that Clarence was really executed in the Tower, but Robert Lee does find some other differences from the fictionalized Plantagenet history we are accustomed to. This plot has no aforementioned devious Buckingham to assist Richard to the throne. Our villain does have unusual help, though, in taking Lady Anne for his wife. The play famously shows Richard's breathtaking gall in single-handedly seducing her verbally, while she is only just mourning her newly dead husband over his coffin. The change here is that Lee forges the union as a persuasive idea of Edward's, to which Anne willingly agrees. This then allows Richard to dissemble the same posture of, "Oh well, if you insist," that he does with the missing Buckingham offer of kingship in Shakespeare. Machiavelli and Mario Puzo would be proud of the political stratagems at work in this family. King Edward's philosophy sounds like a worthy inspiration for the Godfather's Don Corleone. It's an old axiom of mine: marry your enemies and behead your friends. We do get a little comic relief amid the tastefully executed murderings, courtesy of Ernest Cossart's Cockney chimney sweep and his suffering boy. Cossart had carved out a highly regarded Hollywood niche for himself playing unflappable butlers, and during World War II would help to start a fund along with Rathbone and Sir Cedric Hardwicke to aid distressed artists back home in England. Although this conniving Richard does not break the fourth wall and take the audience into his confidence like the bards, there is a ghoulish touch that lets us into his private satisfaction with each development. He keeps a child's dollhouse of figures representing the regal line at court, in which he starts unpromisingly as sixth, and as he eliminates each obstacle to his crown, he discards them one by one into the fire. Roland Lee's direction of actors is as confident and sensitive as in Son of Frankenstein earlier that year. A particular scene highlighting this is in his handling of the prince's murder in the Tower. As the boys, Ronald Sinclair and John Herbert Bond are given enough time to establish a touching innocence before bed without being cloying. Similarly, when Karloff's dragging frame sneaks in to do the ugly deed, he pauses while bent over their sleeping idyll, a moment of possible humane doubt before measuring out his arm span to judge their coffin size. The children are mercifully murdered off-camera, but we hear an unsettling scream, reminiscent somehow of an abattoir pig's slaughter. Incidentally, Sinclair exchanged careers to later become a noted sound editor, eventually working on the first two Die Hard films and Mel Brooks's Spaceballs in 1987. Going back to the accepted story, one other intriguing alteration is in the final battle of Bosworth Field between the forces of Richard and Henry Tudor, convincingly staged with chaotic enthusiasm. Every schoolchild is familiar with King Richard's immortal plea exchanging his kingdom for a horse. On this battlefield, however, he is dispatched wordlessly in matter-of-fact haste. It is Karloff who gets more savourable screen time, cutting and thrusting with vigour till he falls mortally down a hillside. The excellent cast of Tower of London is supported by the impressive period detail of the exterior castle sets built on the Universal backlot. These were so elaborate and effective that they were frequently reused, for example in that year's definitive The Hunchback of Notre Dame, starring Charles Laughton, as we will see. Thanks for listening, and if you like what you've just heard, don't forget to click so, and please hit subscribe. If you build it, they will come.